Hello everyone, we're back, and today we're going to be talking about social class in the United States. This is going to be a very interesting topic. I'm going to start out by saying what prompted me to do this particular teaching is because I have this thing about me that most people don't know, and that is that I like to watch YouTube videos. And one of the topics or types of videos that I like to watch are mukbangs. And I had this thought in my mind. I began to put on my sociological imagination hat. And as I was watching the videos, I found it very interesting at the amount of food that is consumed by the mukbangers or mukbangers on YouTube. And one of the things that crossed my mind was, how is this affordable? And what would prompt someone to actually find watching another person eat interesting? Now, I plan on talking about this topic a little more as I go along with these teachings, but I wanted to bring this topic up under this particular teaching because I think it fits very well. Now, the topic that I'm going to be talking about is the social classes in the United States. Because when we look at the social classes in the United States, we know that not everybody, I'm not talking about global or impoverished countries or underdeveloped countries. I'm talking about in a country such as America, where everything is eaten and everything is experienced in such a rich quality and quantity that it's very hard to believe that America actually have a class system, and that the lowest class system in the United States is considered to be the what we would consider the lower class or poverty. Okay, and so we are not necessarily thinking about the class system just from the perspective of America when we talk about this topic, but we're going to be talking about the class systems, and hopefully as a sociology student you will be able to take this information and apply it to your particular culture or country from where you come from. And two of the books that I'm going to be talking from, one is by James Henslin, and we're going to be talking about social class, and the other one is from John Massionis. And both of these sociologists discuss the class system in the United States. Now, I find it very interesting that we have 6 classes in the United States. 6. And I'm going to briefly mention them to you, and then I'm going to talk to you about them a little bit. The first class that we have is what we consider the capitalist class. And their education comes from prestigious universities. Occupations are considered to be investors and heirs, top executives. They make $100 million plus their income, and they're in the top 1%. Then we have what we call the upper class, college or university, often with postgraduate degrees or study. They are professionals and upper managers. They make upward of $125,000 plus a year, and they're in the top 15%. So if you make $125,000 plus a year, you're in the top 15% in the United States. Okay, so think about that. If you make $1 million plus your income a year, that is, you're in the top 1% in the United States. And the next level is called the lower middle. They have a high school or college, often apprenticeship education. They are semi-professionals and lower managers, craftspeople, foremen. They make about $60,000 a year. They're in the top 34%. So I want you to listen to this because I want you to find where you fit. Then you have the working class, who basically have a high school education. They're factory workers, clerical workers, low-paid retail, sales, and craftspeople. They make about $35,000 a year, and they're in the top 30%. Or they're in the 30% of the population. So 1% of the population is capitalist. 15% of the population is upper middle. 34% of our population is lower middle. 30% of our population is the working class. And 16% of our population is what we call the working poor. They have some high school, laborers, service workers, low-paid salespeople. They make about $17,000 a year, and they're in the 16. They make up 16% of the population. The upper underclass have some high school, unemployed, and part-time on welfare, under $10,000, and they're in the 4% of the population of the United States. Now that's very interesting, wouldn't you think? That 4% of the population, or let's add the 4%, let's add the working class, the working poor, and the underclass. That would be 50% of the population. 30 plus 16 is 46, plus 4 is 50. So 50% of the American population is working poor, and underclass. 50% of the population. What makes this very interesting is that very seldom do we see that population group on social media, because even if those who are in the social media arena, they are not showing you necessarily how they fit in the class system. They're presenting themselves in a way that allows them to be looked at beyond their class status. And you can see this when you look at a lot of the mukbang channels. It's very interesting. So when we look at social classes in the United States, oftentimes we don't look at them from the perspective of class. We just look at the United States from, if you were to look at the United States from the outside, you would think, well, coming here, you know, I could be rich, you know. A lot of people do come here, and oftentimes they will come here, they'll work hard. And we talked about in our previous videos about illegal immigrants who come here oftentimes to make a living and send money back home to their families. We find that a lot of times the immigrants come here and they have a lot of privilege that citizens don't necessarily have. And so they have an opportunity for upward mobility a little faster than the citizens who would be in the working poor, and underclass would have. Because obviously the class system in the United States works for the society in which we live. Otherwise, we would get rid of it. Now, other countries have different type of stratification systems where they group their citizens economically. But in America, our economical grouping system is called class systems. And so this socioeconomic status is just a way of describing the stratification system of the United States. The class system, also imperfect in classifying all Americans, nonetheless offers a general understanding of American social stratification. The United States has roughly 6 social classes: upper class, new money, middle class, working class, working poor, and poverty level. Now that is different. Those are different titles, but they're basically all the same. And so the upper class, or what we would consider old money class, there's 2 categories in the upper class. There's the old money class, and then there's the new money class. And so let's talk about a little bit about what these classes represent. The upper class, which makes up about 1% of the U.S. population, generally consists of those with vast inherited wealth, sometimes called old money. Some people, you've heard them call them blue bloods, or, they are the top elite. Members of the upper class may also have a recognizable family name, such as Rockefeller, DuPont, or Kennedy. In our generation, we think of the Bushes. We think of the Clintons. We think of the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and, those groups. But we also think of other families, because generationally these upper class families have a tendency to change over name wise. However, at the same time, these families still remain in this class stratification, but sometimes the families might go on the back burner and some newer family might come to the forefront. But it does not take away from the wealth of those who were in the forefront, such as the Rockefellers. We don't hear of the Rockefellers too much today, but we know that the Rockefellers are still very much in the upper class. And they are in the upper class, old money type of classes. And so you would consider them. And so these are some members of the upper class work, but their salaries are not their primary sources of income. Most members of this strata have attended college, most likely at some of the most prestigious educational institutions in the country. For example, the Kennedy family is a prime example of an upper class family. Joseph P. Kennedy made his fortune during the 1920s and passed it down to succeeding generations. That is an important statement. Upper class families or groups have a tendency to pass their money down from generation to generation. And most of the time, each generation adds to that wealth, so that they do not lose their status or their stratus or their social class. They do not lose that as they go from generation to generation. It builds. And so then you also have what they consider the new money upper class. That would be what I would consider to be the Trump family. I don't really consider them to be an upper class family as far as old money, but I would consider the Trump family to be more of new money. The category called new money is a relatively new rung on the social ladder and makes up about 15% of the population. New money includes people whose wealth has been around only for a generation or two, also referred to as the nouveaux riches, French, or newly rich. They have earned their money rather than inheriting it. Unlike the members of the upper class, they do not have a family associated with old money. This would be considered Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, Bill Gates, and other celebrities. Athletes and business people fit into this category. Mark Zuckerberg. So the nouveaux riches merit their own category because they make so much money that they lead very different lives from those in subsequent SES groupings. The newly rich simply do not have the day-to-day financial concerns that often plague the rest of society. And so then you have what we would call, and many of us know about the upper class the old money and the new money. So, you know, in the upper class, you have two categories, old money and new money. But then you, as we go down the ladder, you are dealing now with the middle class. And the middle class, remember when we talked about the middle class, we talked about those who make about, you know, $60,000 a year, and they're like in the 34th percentile of the population. And so the next rung of the ladder is the middle class, which we just talked about. The members of the middle class earn their money by working at what could be called professional jobs. They probably have college educations or at least have attended college. These people are managers, doctors, lawyers, professors, and teachers. They rarely wear uniforms, although some might wear distinctive clothing such as physicians' white coats. They are often referred to as white-collar class, referring to the tendency of many middle-class men to wear suits with a white shirt to work. Now, that's interesting. Now, this brings me to my point about the YouTube class, because I think social media needs its own stratification or its own class system, because as long as you are popular and as long as you are bringing in the numbers on social media, you can go in and out of these class systems. And so not everyone that watches social media or attempts to have a social media channel, such as even as myself, have not reached that level where you can get 100,000, 500,000, 1 million viewers, so that you're bringing in all of that wealth and that income. And a good example is Will Smith. I believe he started his channel a couple months ago. He's already at 2.2 million subscribers on his channel. Why is that? Because he's already popular, and so he has a following where he can continue to progress in his acting career, or in whatever career he decides to take on. And so we look at these mukbangers. I look at them as middle class and working class. Now, that would not fit the financial category of a middle class person. Actually, when you look at mukbangers, you're talking about people who are considered upper class. And this is how come so many of them have the ability to buy these large quantities of food. And I'm using mukbangers because I think it's a good example for people to look at. You see them traveling all over the world. You see them buying cars and houses and jewelry. And even the way they spend their money, you can even break it down further into different types of groups, because you can look at those who are in the upper class who are white and how they spend their money, and the upper class who are black, how they spend their money. And so we can look at white and brown skinned people, and we can say, wait a minute, even the way the classes spend their money is different. And so that's how come when you look at the classes or the stratified groups of people in the United States and their economic systems or their economic groupings, you can see why it is that minorities have a hard time fitting into the upper classes. It could be the way that they make their money. It could be the way that they save their money. It could be the way that they spend their money as far as their privileges. But oftentimes you look at these classes and you wonder, how do you make a YouTube channel where you're making millions of dollars in advertisement for YouTube, but you're not bringing in a lot of that money for yourself? Because today you can be big and tomorrow you can be gone. So you would not fit into the upper class old money, but you might fit into the upper class new money, but only for a little while. And so then after the middle class, which we consider the white collar class, then you have the working class. The working class make up about 30% of the population. Okay? Its members may have gone to college, but more have had vocational or technical training. The members of the working class have a variety of jobs, including the following: electrician, carpenter, factory worker, truck driver, police officer. They may have powerful positions. Let's take, for instance, the police officer. His power may make him seem more, can even give you the idea that because of his power, he has money. But money and power don't always go hand in hand. Sometimes power can be in the hands of someone who is not even in a position of power. For instance, let me say that differently. You know how we always think of people who have money with power? That's not always the case. Just because you have money don't mean you have power. And just because you have power doesn't mean you have money. So that's really what I wanted to say. And so the category of the working class, we consider those blue collar workers. This category is also called blue collar class in recognition of the likelihood that many of these individuals wear uniforms to work rather than suits. People in the working class are more likely to be members of unions that are people in the middle class than are people in the middle class. While there are differences between the working class and the middle class in terms of their lives and values, behaviors, and even their voting records, their standards of living are often similar but not identical. And so as we do this, I want you to look at your life and see which of these categories you fit into. And then the next level is the working poor. Another new rung on the socioeconomic ladder is the working poor. How can you be working and poor? It sounds like an oxymoron, working poor. We don't always consider poor people as having jobs, do we? If we look at media, the media oftentimes presents poverty in a way that is so devastating until you look at people that are classified as poor or in poverty. You look at them and as if they have no hope. But poverty and being poor are not the same. You can be poor but not be in poverty. But you cannot be in poverty and not be poor and be poor. Because poor people have jobs. Do you understand that? People who are considered poor work. So don't think that because someone is poor that they don't have an income. Okay, so let's look at what the working poor is. Another new rung on the socioeconomic ladder is the working poor. Estimating how many Americans are in this category is difficult because the line separating them from those who are at or below the poverty level is not solid. Estimates say that approximately 20% of the population could be classified in either the working poor or poverty level categories. Now remember, when we were reading the working poor and the underclass, working poor is 16% of the population. The underclass is 4% of the population. So that makes up that 20% of the population. And so what we're reading here is that a lot of times those lines are blurred between the poor and those who are in poverty, or the poor and the working class. And so people in the working poor category have a low educational level, are not highly skilled, and work at minimum wage jobs. They often work 2 or more part-time jobs and receive no health insurance or other benefits. These individuals are vulnerable to falling below the poverty line. They have very little or no job security, and their jobs are easily outsourced to countries where labor is cheaper. Every economy needs a group of workers that it can hire during an economic upswing and lay off when the economy weakens. The members of the working poor are such people. They are the last hired and the first fired. Do you see do you understand that? We often wonder why, especially in the United States. We often wonder why. Why is it that when our economy is doing well, we tend to forget that we have poor people and people that are in poverty in this country? And when the economy is doing bad, the poor and the poverty seems to be where the politicians tend to focus their attention. Whereas if we would do the opposite, if we would focus on the poor and the poverty when the economy is going well, then we could give them a better cushion and foundation when the economy goes bad. But when the economy is going well, it often benefits the upper classes. It very seldom does it benefit the working poor and the poverty, because those are the groups that we fluctuate, that we use to help balance out our economy. Do you understand that? So when you are looking at someone struggling to get by, or you hear that someone is not doing well, or that the poor is, on a welfare system, where we oftentimes have a tendency to stigmatize the poor and the poverty and say, well, why don't they get a job? Or why don't they do this? Why don't they go to school? They have the same opportunities as everyone else. Well, that's not true, because the poor and the poverty works for society. Society needs that leverage when it's going well. They need that leverage to help balance out the economy. And when it's going bad, they need that leverage to be able to strip away where the economy is maybe bleeding out too much. And so the working poor and the poverty are the first to be hired. They are the last to be hired, and the first to be fired. Do you understand that? That is a very important perspective that you have to look at when you're looking at people who are trying to make a living. And social media has allowed a lot of poverty and poor people to really come up out of those particular classes, and they have been able to go into the working class. And so they're no longer what you could be considered the working poor or the underclass. So there are opportunities for these people, but when you look at the type of jobs that they have, they are not always reliable. And so this should help you understand why it is that poor people and working poor are often the brunt of society when it comes to growth and when it comes to its failure to grow. And so these people are used oftentimes. A lot of religious people say, they have a way of having cognitive dissonance when it comes to poor people, because they'll say, well, the Bible says the poor you always have with you. Well, you will always have them with you as long as you don't do anything about it. But if you have the ability as a society to help your citizens come up out of poverty, if you will provide the same access to resources to achieve the American dream to every citizen, then you would not have these class systems. Not to this level where you have 6 classes, and there's probably even more, because within each class that you're dealing with, there are other classes. As we found out when we talked about the upper class, you have new money and old money. So you can have, even in the upper class, what you would consider to be the new money, the working money, or the poor upper class. Why? Because they don't fit in with the new money. They don't fit in with the old money. So, society and humanity, just society in general, need groupings. They need the ability to group people in order to maintain control, in order to maintain civility, and in order to maintain growth in the society in which they are in. And so oftentimes we don't look at the class system the way that we should. But if we do if we begin to open our eyes and look at class systems, then we can see that class systems have a purpose. They have a function, as we learned. We talked about the sociological perspectives. They have a function. And their function, oftentimes, as we read in here, that oftentimes their function is that, you know, whenever society decides, okay, we don't, you know, we need to, you know, trim down the economy. We need to trim back a little bit. So what they have a tendency to do is when they trim back, they have a tendency to trim back on the wrong class. They have a tendency to trim back on the working class, or on what we would consider the working poor. That's the group that society says is fluid, it's fluctuating. We can, if we get rid of them when we need to, when the economy is doing bad, then we'll just spill that group over into the welfare system. And then we'll talk about how bad they are. We'll talk about how much they are working on the economy and how much they are depleting the resources of the economy. We can talk about them when we dump them from jobs, because on here it says they are the working poor and the poor. They're the last hire and the first fire. And so you wonder why we have welfare systems, because the welfare systems are built so that it can catch those that the economic system decides it wants to dump out when it's necessary. So when the economy's going good, these guys, they get jobs, but they're the last to get the jobs. When the economy is going bad, they're the last to rehire and the first to be fired. And so it makes no sense. It's a oxymoron altogether. You want people to work, you fuss at them for not working, and then when you are in control of the economy and when the economy does not go in the way you want it to go, you want to fire them. You want to get rid of them. You want to dump them back into the system. And so often people don't understand that stratification has a lot to do with the weight of the economy. Or how the economy is maintained or sustained. And so a staggering number of Americans currently live below the poverty level. In order to solve the problem of the nation's poor, we must first understand who and where they are. So, who are the poor people? Now, before we talk about who the poor are, do you consider yourself to be poor? Do you know any poor people? And if you do, let's put on your sociological imagination. What interactions, symbolisms do you look at when you are classifying someone as poor? How does poor people function in society? How do they interact? How do they conflict with the other classes of people? And so let's look at this. About 60% of poor people are white. Did you know that? 66% of poor people are white. Why? Because white people have the majority, especially in the United States. So there would be a higher percentage of people in poverty that are white, reflecting the fact that white people outnumber people of race and ethnic groups in the United States. And that's what we just said. About 25% of the people living in poverty are black. Now, if you consider the percentage of blacks in the United States, I think the number of blacks in the United States is a very low number. The last time I read, I think it was like 17%. But let's go on and let's see. About 25% of the people living in poverty are black. The term feminization of poverty refers to the increasing number of female-headed households living at or below the poverty level. That is interesting. Why am I laughing? Because it just said one of the symbols that you can look at if you want to see if someone's poor is if there's a woman who's the head of the household. Let's read it again. The term feminization of poverty refers to the increasing number of female-headed households living at or below the poverty level. That means they don't have a man in the house. There's no daddy around. Might have some boyfriends, but they're the head of the house, the female. In the 1960s, approximately 25% of all female-headed households were in poverty. That figure is about 50% today. An increasing number of children are affected by this trend. As of 2005, about 16% of children under age 18 live in poverty. About 80% of them live in households headed by a single female. That blew my mind. And you wonder why. How much, when you compare the amount of money that women make to men in the United States, can you connect why it is that women-headed households or female-headed households are the greatest number of people in poverty? Because they don't make the same amount of money as a man who is the head of the household. They don't make the same amount of money. So that's one reason. But let's go on. So, what are poor people? Though all states have poverty, poor people are concentrated in the inner cities and in the rural South. Social economist William Julius Wilson believes that the relatively high level of poverty in inner cities is due to the lack of jobs. He says that many companies have relocated to suburban areas or have downsized their urban operations. Still, others have moved their manufacturing facilities to other countries to take advantage of cheaper labor costs and laws favoring the development of new businesses. The rural South has a high rate of poverty for several reasons. Now, remember we talked about earlier how the working poor, poverty, and impoverished oftentimes lose their jobs first when the economy is doing bad. But these are some of the reasons why. So, let's talk about why it is that the rural South has a high rate of poverty and some of the issues that they face. Manufacturing concerns have preferred to operate in suburban areas, which we talked about. Which are closer to interstate highways, railroads, and airports that enable manufacturers to transport their products. Educational levels in the South tend to be lower. About 12% of the general U.S. population drops out of high school. In the South, the dropout rate is about 15%. That's a high percentage of people that are dropping out of just high school. We're not even talking about those who have gone to school or into higher education. The increasing demand of technology requires employers who are flexible, skilled, and able to learn rapidly. A workforce composed of people with relatively low levels of education and few job skills is simply not attractive to potential employers. So we talked about before that a way to really bridge the gap between, let's just say, to bridge the gap between the working poor and the impoverished, the way to bridge that gap is to give equal access to resources that will allow them to be able to sustain a living. If they don't have access to the proper resources, then how can they find the skills or learn the skills necessary to be able to move throughout these different issues that happen with employers? How can they move out of these urban suburban neighborhoods or these urban neighborhoods and go where the jobs are if they have no money? So you see, society has a way causing social strain or causing strain on people or causing role strains. And this is how come when we talked about roles, we talked about how roles are constructed by society. So the poor, the working poor, and the poverty, those classes of people function for society. Now that makes no sense. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't seem right. Even morally, it sounds crazy. But for society, it works. And so the consequences of poverty are high. More than any other social class, the poor suffer from short life expectancies and health problems, including heart disease, high blood pressure, and mental illness. Reasons include the following. Now, while we can look at ourselves and say, okay, no matter what class we're in, all classes have health issues, heart disease, high blood pressure, mental health. These diseases or medical issues are not exclusive to the poor. However, they experience higher numbers of people because they don't have access to proper medical care. They don't have access to proper nutrition. And so they don't have access to proper social skills or social abilities. And so they have a tendency to not even be raised properly or socialized properly so that they can develop properly. Their psychological states are not necessarily looked at. And so they have so many issues that work against them already. And so when they birth children who have these diseases in their DNA oftentimes. And it becomes a perpetuated situation. And so you can see how society has a way of keeping these classes of people together. And so the social construction of poverty, of working class and of poor, and all of these stratification systems work for society. They function. They have conflicts, but they function for society. And so society doesn't have to answer to the powerful elite, to those who really keep society together as far as the upper class, the working class, the middle class, the powerful, the rich. They don't have to worry about these things. Whenever the employment system takes a hit, oftentimes you will find these CEOs are retiring with these humongous $1-million packages. When we had that Wall Street crisis, when Obama became president, during that crisis, you know how many billionaires and millionaires got bailed out by the American people, by the poverty, by the working class, by the poor, by the taxes? They got bailed out. Why? Because they maintain the upper strata for society. And if the upper strata fails, because this is where our politicians are, this is where our government officials are, this is where those who actually make our laws, this is where they are sustained. So if the upper classes fail, if we allow them to fail, our whole system comes crashing down. And so it's important for them to keep the rich rich, because by keeping the rich rich, we keep our career politicians. We keep our career judges. I mean, look at the Supreme Court justices. They're in there for a lifetime. You know, some of them retire after they turn 80 or retire after a certain age, but basically they're in there for a lifetime. Why is that? So when we look at the consequences of poverty, we can see that poor people are often not well educated about diet and exercise. Educated or just have access to proper nutrition. You don't have to educate me on proper nutrition if I have access to it. I'll make better choices. Educating impoverished people does help educate them, but being in poverty and being a working class person doesn't mean you can't read, you don't know how to do research, doesn't mean you doesn't have the desire for upward mobility. And so educating people is not always the necessary tool. Sometimes you have to give them access to the resources, physically put the proper nutrition in their communities. And so they say that they're more likely in higher social strata to be overweight and suffer from nutritional deficits. Of course. Why? Because they are given they're on the bottom of the food chain. They're the ones where you see all of the fast food change in their communities. They're the ones who have to be able to afford the cheaper priced foods, the foods that are not necessarily nutritional for them. So they eat a lot of packaged food, prepackaged goods, cereals, pastas, rice, chicken, poultry. They cannot afford the richer foods, the more healthier food. Do you know that fruits and vegetables are more expensive sometimes than meat and pastas? Fruits and vegetables should be cheap. You can grow fruits and vegetables in your kitchen. But if you don't have access to seeds, if you have companies like the Monsanto company trying to control or patent seeds that are just natural to the earth, of course you're going to have people who have poor nutrition. And said they are less likely to have health insurance. Why? Because they can't afford it. Why can't they afford it? Because health insurance is priced for the rich. It's priced for the upper class. Why? Because those are the ones they want to take care of. Because oftentimes health insurance or people who run health insurance companies, they are in the upper classes. And so they price these insurances so that they are not affordable for everybody. So this is another example of poverty, people in poverty and working poor, and businesses who employ the working poor cannot afford insurance to cover their employees. And so this is how come I think it's important that insurance should be free. I'm not talking about doctors not having access to the ability to make a living. But people should not be dying because they don't have access to a doctor. That makes no sense. But let me try to stay within the academic context of what we're talking about. And so they're less likely to have insurance, so they put off going to the doctor until a problem seems like a matter of life and death. At that time, they must find a public health facility that accepts patients with little or no insurance. Oftentimes, when they go into the emergency rooms, they receive enormous bills, which affects their credit, which then puts them even further into it impacts them and strains them even further into the impoverished role. And so living in poverty brings chronic stress. Listen, I don't consider myself to be in poverty, but I'm stressed. So that is not a symbol that we would want to always apply to the poor because they're stressed. But they have higher levels of stress because they worry every day about what they're going to eat, what they're going to drink, what clothes they're going to wear, how they're going to take care of their children. Are they going to have a roof over their head? I worry about these things. The rich worry about these things. I mean, money is not necessarily a security blanket for anybody. But when you have money and power and access to resources, then you can rest a little easier. So it's not always about having money. It's about actually having the resources, having the power, having the ability, and having access to sustainability. And so members of the middle class, they got chronic stress. Poor people live every day with the uncertainty that we talked about, whether they could afford to eat, pay the electric bill, or make the rent payment. Members of the middle class also, we said that, they also have stress. So poor people usually do not have jobs that offer them vacation time for them to even relax. Because number one, they already can't work a 40-hour-a-week job because they're working in low-paying jobs. So those jobs can't afford to pay them to go on vacation for 2 weeks. They need them to work every day. And sometimes they may not get to work every day. They may work 2 or 3 times a week. They may not work 8 hours. They may work 4 hours a day. So there's a lot of strain on people who are in the working class, who are poor, and who are in poverty. And so they don't have any time for the accessories that most people in the upper 50% do have access to, or the upper 70% have access to. So they have higher levels of unresolved stress, financial problems, and poor health can wreak havoc within a relationship. Poor people report more relationship problems than do people in other classes and have higher rates of divorce and desertion. The children of such families are more likely than their middle-class counterparts to grow up in broken homes or in single-parent, female-headed households. There we go again, the stigmatizing of the female. So we have a culture of poverty. And so in this culture of poverty, it's a whole system. And when you get entangled in a system, it's hard to get out of that system because that system is meant to function as a system. It's just like the system of your vehicle. If you take one part out of that, then the car does not go. Just like the culture of poverty, if you remove something from the culture of poverty, it does not function any longer as a culture of poverty. So something and someone and something or some system is keeping this culture of poverty together. Anthropologist Oscar Lewis coined the term culture of poverty, which means that poor people do not learn the norms and values that can help them improve their circumstances. Hence, they become trapped in a repeated pattern of poverty. Because many poor people live in a narrow world in which all they see is poverty and desperation. They never acquire the skills or the ambition that can help them rise above the poverty level. Since culture is passed down from one generation to the next, parents teach their children to accept their circumstances rather than to work to change them. The cycle of poverty then becomes self-perpetuating. And this is where we're trying to get. It's so much more to this. And this topic is my heart. And that's why I'm putting so much more effort into it. It's a longer video. But we have to understand that poverty is a construction of society. No one should be in poverty. No one should not have access to resources to sustain a living, to take care of themselves and their families. No one should be in these positions. But the culture of poverty makes it possible. It's perpetuated. It's perpetuated from generation to generation to generation. And one of the other things we need to remember is that even though there's upward mobility inside these families that are impoverished, not all the time is it at a higher rate. It's a lower rate. In my family, there's 14 siblings from my dad's 3 marriages. My dad and my mom had 8 children. And out of those 8 children, not all of us are considered to be in the upper class. So you're not going to always see, just because someone has an education and just because someone has a job or they are considered upper class does not mean they are not still functioning in the culture of poverty. It could take generations. It may take our great-grandchildren to bring our family out of this culture of poverty. So while we may be doing good now, it is not really considered upward mobility until it affects the next generation. Because I would not want to be living in an upper middle class situation, and then my grandkids come up and they're in the working class and the poor class. That's a problem, because somewhere along the line, I have failed, or I have failed to socialize my children, and my children have failed to socialize their children, and to bring them to an understanding of what society expects of them, how they can perpetuate a positive life in society, how they can have access to resources. I have 2 college degrees and a PhD. But what does that mean if that does not benefit the next generation in my family? How does it benefit them? So this is what we need to look at. When we have access to resources, do we pass them down to our families? Do we come together and say, listen, this person in our family is impoverished. How can we bring them out of that? Because just because you came out of it doesn't mean that your family is now out of that culture of poverty, because you can leave or you can die and your family members or those around you could fall back into that culture of poverty because we have failed to teach them how to stay and remain, sustain themselves out of that. And so hopefully there's so much more we can do with this video, but these are short teachings, and they are just general foundational teachings from social science, from a social science graduate. And so my hope is that by bringing these classes to you or bringing these discussions to you, it will begin to help you begin to think about how society sees you and how you see society, how you function, interact, and conflict with society. It gives you perspective. And so to all of you mukbangers out there, think about that. Think of all the types of people that are looking at you and watching you eat. Some of those people will never have access to the quality and the quantity of foods that you are eating, but they are entertained, they are sustained, and oftentimes they are very happy to see that there is a way out, or they can see something other than their little area of life where they live. And hopefully, if anyone contacts you and says, listen, I need food, I don't have food, I don't have money, I don't have access to the resources to eat the way you eat, hopefully within your heart, you will see that there is somebody out there that needs what you have. And maybe you can share something with them. Maybe you can share a meal. Maybe you can do a video showing you feeding the poor, going into neighborhoods, giving back to the communities that have given to you and have allowed you to have such luxurious lifestyles. We know that the work is hard. We know that it takes a lot to be a mukbanger. And why am I specifying mukbangers? Because I think the consumption, the visual consumption of food and of material wealth that is seen by the world can oftentimes be mistaken by those who are in poverty. And oftentimes those who are in poverty can feel even more strain watching you eat and not having access to the same foods or the same resources that you have access to. Now, I'm not telling you that you need to give up your job, because you need to keep your job, because I enjoy watching you. But I want you to just remember that there are those who need us and who need to be able to call on us for help at times. And we need to all be mindful that there is always somebody who is living a lesser life than what we are living. Hopefully this video will help you and will give you some insight and allow you to open your heart to those who are asking you for help. Read your comments. I read many comments on a lot of these mukbang channels, and people are asking for help. People are asking for food. And so it's not all the time that, you're able to support everybody that asks. But we should not just eat on these channels. Perhaps we can provide information where people can go to food kitchens. Maybe some of you mukbangs can go to food kitchens and do a mukbang at a food kitchen. It doesn't always have to be these luxurious meals, these expensive meals. Sometimes it just needs to be a simple meal where you can identify with some of your viewers. And so I just want to thank you all for watching, and for hopefully you will like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. And together we can begin to build a social arena on this channel that will bridge the gap between citizenry all over the world. So I thank you so much, and I will see you next time. And like I said, please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Emphasis on comment and subscribe. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.